Australia's military involvement in the Vietnam War was the longest in duration of any war in Australia. Australia's participation in the war was formally declared at the end when the Governor-General issued a proclamation on the 11th of January 1973. The only combat troops remaining in Vietnam were a platoon guarding the Australian Embassy in Saigon, which was withdrawn in June 1973's history. In this episode, we will be going through Australia's involvement in the Vietnam War and including some different perspectives on our participation, as well as our top professors going through communism and so on. Stay tuned.
World War II, the United States and the Allied units were the two new superpowers. The great military of the nations dominated the rest of the world and produced two groups. As return bloc were comprised of countries headed by the Soviet Union and the Western Bloc, which also comprised of countries headed by capitalist United States. The conflict between the Eastern and Western Bloc became known as the Cold War. It was a conflict that stretched on Europe, but eventually extended to the Asian Pacific region. The divisions between the Eastern and Western Bloc occurred toward the closing months of the World War II. At that time, the past mentioned from 1894 to 1978 was the Australian Prime Minister. From 1949 to 1996, the longest serving Prime Minister in the country's history. The Meiji era showed its main generational change with post-war reconstructions and the consolidation of communist remain in North Vietnam and communism in situations elsewhere. Political system where the government control the nations well in the belief that the state should provide everyone with an equal share and where repeats of shifts is very limited. The Communist Party were a minority group with Israel claims only 5,000 members in 1940, but for a time working on the ideologies, confusion, sectional self-rule, and literary of far greater number. It had a market effect both on the shaping of the attitudes of Australians to the world in pending effective Australian participants in the war.
Vietnam is a long, narrow country in Southeast Asia. It extends from the South China Sea to the Gulf of Tonkin in the north. During the second half of the 19th century, it was conquered and colonized by France and became part of French Indochina. During World War II, Vietnam was occupied by Japan. In 1945, Ho Chi Minh, the leader of the Viet Minh Independence League, overthrew the Japanese-supported government of Bao Dai. In 1954, at the United Nations Geneva Conference, Vietnam was divided at 17th parallel of latitude into two countries. North Vietnam had a communist government headed by Ho Chi Minh, whose most important appearance came in 1924 when he visited the Soviet Union. He believed that communism was the answer to the problem of poverty facing the Vietnamese peasants. South Vietnam had a Western style of government led by Ngo Bình Diep. He was a Catholic, his ancestors having been converted by French missionaries in the 17th century. He was elected president of South Vietnam in elections which were violent and hardly fair. This situation was not acceptable to North Vietnam, who, with help from the Communist China, gave military aid to the Viet Cong in South Vietnam. The Viet Cong wanted a united Vietnam under a communist government.
Với kinh nghiệm của một người đã từng sống trong thời kỳ chiến tranh chống Pháp, tôi có thể nhận định được rằng đó là một khó khăn mà Australia có thể phải đối mặt với Việt Nam, bởi vì theo tôi được biết, Việt Nam là một đất nước có lịch sử vô cùng hào hùng của chiến tranh, đã đánh lùi được quân Pháp và Nhật trong đó là hai quốc gia mạnh lúc bấy giờ. Nhưng Australia thì ngược lại, Australia là một đất nước khá non trẻ vì tuy nhiên trong thời kỳ chiến tranh, Australia có điều kiện sống tốt giống như những người dân Pháp và Nhật. Nhưng khi đến Việt Nam, nó là một đất nước nghèo, họ cực kỳ khắc nghiệt. Australia rất khó thích nghi và đó là một điều rất vô cùng quan trọng cho các nước khác đã được xâm chiếm Việt Nam đã phải làm vậy.
I think the reason Australia should not have been involved is that it was not following its own national interests, but supporting the interests of another nation like the United States. You can argue that the US was an important ally, but still, Australia, it was not Australia. Also, an independent Vietnam in 1945 or North Vietnam in 1955 would not threaten Australian interests in the area. So, did we really have to invade a country that wasn't even in war with us? And the decision was to prevent the unification of a country. Is it right or wrong? The Vietnam War started on the 1st of November 1955 and ended on the 30th of April 1975. It was the longest war that Australia was involved in. The Prime Minister at the time recognised the value of Australian defence treaties with the United States. In 1965, Menzies committed Australian troops to fight in South Vietnam. In 1949, a civil war in China ended with a total victory for the communist forces of Mao Zedong. When China, the largest nation on earth, came under communist control, the Western democracies believed that the free world was threatened. The democratic fears of a communist world revolution seemed to be coming true. It was believed that if one nation fell under communist domination, its neighbours would fall like a line of dominoes. These dominoes here represent the domino theory. If the whole of Vietnam was to fall to communism, it was thought that it would gradually spread to neighbouring countries including Cambodia, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, and eventually Australia. This was a domino theory, and in Australia, the fear of the yellow parole from the north was replaced with an even greater fear of the Soviet Union's red flag sweeping a red tide across the globe. In Australia, communism had become a threat to our national security, and the world lived with the scary thought of the Cold War's escalation to the full-scale welfare. So the Australian government decided to do an effective strategy for defence. At the end of World War II, the government, Korea was split between an anti-communism government in the south and a communist government in the north. It was a communist threat to democracy and world peace. The Australian government believed joining the fight in Korea was to be against another domino falling to Chinese communism, as it thrust southwards showed its loyalty to powerful ally, the United States. They exposed a diplomatic gesture so as to call its allies for protection for a communist attack on Australian soil. A forward defence is a safe strategy for Australia, and that if Australia must encounter any threat to fight before it reached Australian shores, Australia could be most effectively defended.
Lầu Năm Góc tuyên bố nước Việt Nam trở lại thời kỳ đồ đá.
Alliance is an important reason why Australia decided to involve in Vietnam War. Two new alliance agreements were established, ANZUS and CEATO. The ANZUS agreement of 1951, Australia, New Zealand and the United States agreed to come on the other aid in the event of attack. The CEATO alliance of 1954, the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization provided for the defensive action to be taken in the event of an attack on the United States, Britain, French, Australia, New Zealand, Thailand, the Pakistan, Philippines, South Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos will also guarantee protection under the treaty security arrangement. CEATO was used by the United States to justify their presence in Vietnam. Australia had to make itself essentially dependent on the American help in the event of external aggression, and that dependence had a price tag of the involvement in the American foreign policy. The plain and simple fact was that if Australia did not have America now, then America might not come to Australia in her hour of need if it even arose.
Australians, oh, let us rejoice, for we are young and free. We've golden soil.
So yes, Australia's relationship with America was an important factor in Australian involvement, but it was not the only one. The Australian people had been told so often to prepare for war that they all thought it was only a matter of time before they would have to go into the battle with the communists, because psychologically, Australia had been prepared for another war since the conflict in Korea. Compulsory military training and the universal conscription had been briefly reintroduced in 1951. To sum everything up, Australia really had no part being in the Vietnam War, but we did feel threatened by the red tide coming into Australian soil and wiping us all out. So we had to do something which was forward different. Well, the idea of this was to go over the war and fight before it come to us, and also another reason was to help out our ally, America, and to prove to them our loyalty. Till this day, we remember all those who lost their lives in this bloody war, lest we forget.
Next week's episode on An Idiot's Guide to the Vietnam War, we will be investigating the support, opposition, and the impact on Vietnam veterans and their families.